Inman, former Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Director of the National Security Agency, and currently President and Chief Executive Officer of MCC, a unique American consortium of high-tech companies collaborating in over-the-horizon research on fifth-generation computers. Gilbert and Sullivan would have labeled Admiral Inman the very model of a modern American public servant. With a combination of native intelligence, down-home savvy, ethical roots, and endless energy, especially energy, he exemplifies a managerial competence all too rare in American government and indeed in American business. This combination of capabilities has served him well through his multi-staged career, a career that's provocatively illustrative, especially for students in a school like this one, of the possibilities in American public life. In spite of his specialty, which was intelligence, well known to preclude anyone rising to the level of admiral, he climbed to the top of the career service. This ignited a second stage of his career in appointive service, where his performance in several appointive positions certified a capacity for leadership that earned him the admiration not only in government, but in the business community as well. One of my colleagues here at the school talks about the hat trick in careers. Individuals who manage positions in government, business, and the academy. We remain hopeful that after Bobby has built this company and made his multi-millions, the academy remains for him, and we hope that Harvard might be lucky enough to be the place. A native of Ronesboro, Texas, which most of you haven't heard of, where his father ran the local gas station, Bobby Inman graduated at age 19 from the University of Texas. After a year in law school, which convinced him that there must be more to life than torts, the prospect of being drafted pushed him to join the Navy, where he served on an aircraft carrier during the height of the Korean War. He originally had planned to serve for 3 years and get out, but each time, just as he was about to leave, some wise personnel officer offered him an assignment in London or Paris or wherever, and little by little he stayed, and each time for just one more stint, but before it was over had risen to the top of the naval career service as a 4-star admiral. In 1977, again as he was about to escape, President Carter appointed him director of the National Security Agency, the branch of government whose 20,000 employees monitor the communications of foreign governments and devise codes to protect U.S. secrets. As director, Bobby received high praise for his integrity and his competence. In 1981, again, he was about to escape, but his new commander-in-chief, Ronald Reagan, made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. He became deputy director of CIA, where as the agency's number 2 man, he ran CIA's daily operation, placing special emphasis on rebuilding the capacity for foreign assessment. In 1982, Admiral Inman finally did retire from government, and after considering an array of alternatives, some of them even like spending time at a university like this one, he chose to become chairman and chief executive officer of a new entrepreneurial microelectronics and computer corporation entitled MCC, a collaborative research think tank begun by 10 of America's top electronic firms to pursue blue sky computer research. MCC was created to try to create something like the Japanese consortia that would make the U.S. somewhat more effective with the Japanese in the competition. And there he's been working with a number of major American corporations, trying to encourage cooperation among corporate executives who've traditionally seen each other as natural enemies, something for which his service in government had prepared him well. So please join me tonight in giving a warm welcome to a former electronic age super spy who's currently an electronic age super businessman, Admiral Bobby Inman.
Dean Allison, it's a great pleasure to be invited back to the forum. After that splendid introduction, I feel I would be better off if I left now while I was ahead of the game before I talk. To those who've come this evening, I feel the need to make a disclaimer. When I came the last time, it was to talk about the state of the U.S. intelligence community, something I'd spent 30 years of my life involved in and had a reasonable depth of knowledge. Tonight we're going to talk about some problems where my knowledge spans no more than 3.5 years. I have the zealotry of a convert. You'll forgive that, I hope, as I try to get you to focus with me on a whole series of new problems that I find fascinating, that ultimately may have at least as much, maybe more, to do with this country's long-term security as those that I dealt with for the first portion of my adult life. Basic theme of the evening is to talk about emerging technologies and the strategies to deal with them. But the real theme is to try to understand the impact on the society of creating technology and using technology to create opportunity, to create jobs, and how that process must change to deal with the reality of the world that's changing around us. If one looks back over our history, we were importers of technology the first 100 years of our existence. On balance, we used that imported technology with reasonable effectiveness to span a great continent. But it was in the heart of the darkest days of the Republic, 1862, when Congress, in its wisdom, enacted the Morrill Act, creating the land-grant colleges, laying the basis for creating technology on a very broad base in this country. That same Congress enacted the legislation creating the National Academy of Science, understanding a basic principle, a country that focused on pushing frontiers of technology had a prospect of offering a steadily improving standard of living for its citizens. In the long sweep of time from 1865 to 1940, that base for creating technology expanded substantially. Much of the growth in private institutions like this one, as well as those in public. But if one looks back, while the base was very large, it was not a source of a great flow of new technology immediately to economic growth. The neighboring institution, a little way down the pike here in Cambridge, did a study a couple of years ago in which they concluded that between 1865 and 1940, about 80% of the growth of our GDP came from creating and commercializing technology. But a substantial portion of that technology was still imported from abroad. World War II fundamentally changed that status. What it brought was a focus on how do you accelerate the movement of technology from its ability to be created in universities, in national laboratories, in industrial laboratories, out to specific applications. Obviously, the driving motivation was to produce the weapons to win a war. But if one looks closely, out of that same effort came such diverse contributions to our economic growth as synthetic fibers, and indeed the first large-scale computers. One could dwell all evening on the period of the post-war era, when with a surge of investment, our lead moved to preeminence in creating new technology. Perhaps also an arrogance about our overwhelming capacity, that it was so large that we didn't need to worry about any potential lag in the numbers of graduate students in science and engineering, or in our focus on pushing the frontiers of a whole range of new technologies. Hallmark in that early era was the investment through the Department of Defense, largely the Office of Naval Research and its counterparts, funding graduate studies with a minimum of bureaucracy, writing of proposals and shopping them around various cities looking for grants. The scientists visited, examined the nature of research, concluded that it was a new area that offered the prospect of frontiers, writing out an authorization for a grant. We began in the early 1960s a new approach to national security, is it cost effective? The question was no longer what might we need to know, how might we need to use evolving, but rather can we focus on only those systems that are going to produce direct payload for weapon systems. And there was no response in creating other mechanisms to make up for the fundamental funding of basic research and expanding the pool of U.S. scientists. I dwell on that because there's another critical event that fits over that framework. Out of the war, World War II, the leadership that had governed set out to create processes to try to deal in more far-sighted ways with this country's long-term national security need. National Security Act, National Security Council staff. The initial focus was on the complete and the size and deployment of our defense forces. And shortly with the Marshall Plan came the focus on foreign aid. Another 10 years or so went by, and then we added to that national security agenda arms control in a substantial, structurally organized way. And that has remained to this date the mandate for examining the country's national security. But that's in a framework of a domestic marketplace. The bulk of the application of technology was focused on did we create jobs, market, and sell products in this country. And as late as 1960, no major sector of the U.S. economy had more than 10% of its revenues drawn from international trade. Our sales abroad are successful sales here, like other countries. 25 years have seen a very remarkable change in that marketplace. 25% of the revenues in the industrial sector coming from international trade is no longer unusual, but if you look at it, the major gains have come from successful sales in this country of products produced abroad. The technology may well have originated here, but the companies successfully marketing that tech U.S. marketplace frequently have been foreign owned. There are those who would wistfully roll back history and have us return to the world of a domestic marketplace. My judgment isn't a feasible option at all. If it isn't a feasible option, then clearly one should stand back and look at what are the lessons from that past history. What are the techniques that offer the prospect of sustaining steady growth at a different marketplace with job opportunities and improvement, and fitting that into the context of our overall national security. Now, the problem is more complex than just changing done in the past. It's more complex because in the 10 to 15 years out ahead of us, some of our best scientists tell us that the pace of change is going to be very, very rapid. There are a whole series of emerging techniques that offer the prospect of very substantial economic growth in the decade, about 15 years out ahead of us. Now, for this part of my remarks, I am vetted to a year-long study effort conducted by the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Council I was privileged, which attempted to assess what are the emerging technologies that have significant impact on economic growth over the next 15 years, in broad terms, and what will be the impact of that on foreign relations. Two former Deputy Secretaries of State were one to look at west-west, and the other to look at north-south. And my effort was to look at east-west. With all great apology to those two esteemed former Deputy Secretaries of State, I would give you that the three papers on the impact on foreign policy of these emerging technologies are eminently from. But the 6 papers on emerging technologies merit some attention. National Academy of Science published last summer under the title Technological Frontiers in Foreign Relations, the result of that effort. The 6 areas to watch: telecommunications, microelectronics, aerospace, materials, really materials processing. energy, and biotechnology. In the communications area, our experts tell us that we will see substantial growth in all the existing terrestrial means of telecommunications over the next 10, 15 years. But the most dramatic growth will come in fiber optics. And that's of enormous importance from the ability to move, manipulate, access large volumes of data in tiny amounts of time. Finally, a very wide bandwidth signal of great video quality. And it's been that narrow pipeline that in the past has so often restricted our ability to move or to access large quantities of data with great speed. We'll see movements toward interoperability and networking on very major scales. Moving to use new approaches in design. We're already seeing it in the design of the smart building, the design of the smart house, where there's as much focus from the outset on the distribution of information as on the distribution of power. Teleconferencing will be a major feature, including national leaders can conduct a teleconference, in some cases among allies in a classified mode, to decide how to do crises. Or in the military, one could look at the same display of information at 4 or 5 levels of command, discuss how to respond to it. There are a lot of people who don't think that would be a common good, but the potential for doing it will exist. The only limiting features now visible on that telecommunications expansion are the reality that some countries are going to limit the import of equipment to protect the domestic industry, thereby impacting on the interoperability that could be achieved. The reality that the industrialized countries have been using most of the commercially viable frequency spectrum for a long time. The newly industrializing countries are eager to have a larger share of that frequency spectrum, but they're only growing. And dealing with satellite communications, the desire for that reliable point-to-point link. Sitting out at 22,000 miles in synchronous orbit around the equator. The reality is it's already getting crowded out there. And unless we develop some pretty skillful ways of vacuum cleaning debris out of the way, that's ultimately going to be a limiting factor in how far that expansion goes. The microelectronics area, the pace of change comes from computing, but it is our ability to compact vast quantities of information in single chips that makes feasible the change. Now, for those few in this group who are not computer buffs, let me try to put that pace of change in some context. The first large-scale computer was assembled at great cost to support the attack on the German and Japanese codes during World War II. That machine occupied a space larger than this area we're gathered in here tonight, and the ancillary support equipment occupied space at least as large. Today, 100 times the computing power of that large machine is found in a small portable PC that would sit very comfortably on half of this podium. Over the next 10 years, at least 10 times the power of that portable PC, but more likely 100 times the power, will be found on a single chip the size of your thumbnail. Now, with that's going to come a whole variety of new approaches to computing. We'll still have much focus on, and we'll have, much faster supercomputers, very large mainframes with thousands of portals to serve at least the financial industry, distributed processing systems attacking problems in parallel. But there'll also be great growth in embedded computers, in the ability to create special purpose machines at an economically viable cost for a whole range of functions. We've known for a great many years how to build special purpose machines to do a single function much faster than the largest mainframe. But it's very expensive. It will be economically viable 10 years out to do a whole range of special purpose computing machines. In the aerospace area, our experts told us that we would not see significant change in the shape of airframes used commercially over this near 10 to 15 year time frame. But we would see major gains through introduction of composite materials, superalloys, other changes in greater range, better speed, better fuel economy, better durability, easier maintainability, better fuel economy. Out in space, new platforms for exploration with the Space Telescope being next in line, but then the space station. Beyond the space station's use for exploration, clearly its use in a surveillance and reconnaissance role, a major argument ahead of us of whether it will also be used as a staging platform for weapons in space. And beyond that, the likelihood of using it as a staging platform for manufacturing in space. In the materials area, the decade of the chemist is already with us. The ability to create very lightweight, extremely strong and sturdy materials that can be shaped into very different forms and structures, resistant to heat, wind, sand, cold, already being used hidden from public view in the so-called stealth technologies military, but offering the prospect in commercial application some years down the road of letting humans operate for extended periods of time in climes that are now inhospitable, in deserts, in Arctic regions, underwater, out in space. In the energy area, our experts took a pessimistic view about U.S. leadership in much of the energy sector, but nonetheless saw it as a major growth area. Failure to invest as the primary factor. The French, the Japanese have sustained significant investment in nuclear power generation technology. Japanese have sustained major investment in coal gasification, cogeneration. Not clear that anybody's maintaining the level of investment in solar that might make a difference. In this country, somewhat more promise for extended life batteries and for fuel cells, and the likelihood of major gains in recovering more oil from discovered fields and recovering from aging fields for much longer periods of time, and much greater precision in locating new sources of fossil fuel energy, both at greater depths on land and with greater precision under oceans. And finally, in the biotechnology area, fork in the road coming very soon now, with the early major gains being in healthcare, and beyond that, yet another revolution in agriculture. The prospect that the early commercial gains of recombinant DNA may well be leapfrogged, with the immunologists providing the latchkey with monoclonal antibodies for successful attack on a whole range of viruses that divide both medical science and agricultural science today. Now, as one looks at both the past record and the emerging opportunities and tries to make some assessment on how we deal effectively with the opportunities and the challenges in a world of a steadily expanding international marketplace, I would try to draw at least a few general lessons. First and foremost, the demands on the pool of talent will expand substantially. The competency of the workforce, those going out to work in the automated factories, the automated offices, the automated financial institutions, the automated service institutions, will be significantly higher. There's a major job out ahead of training and retraining for those being displaced or moved as automation progresses. The need for less specialization and more breadth in baccalaureate education. A clear need for more engineers and scientists, but a critical need not to do it at the expense of the other academic sectors. Because of the reality of that international marketplace, if we think we're going to be successful in the year 2000 by following the strategy of our ancient British forebears of let them speak English, we're likely to be in for a very rude shock, because our principal economic competitors are going to be out there marketing in the language of the country where they want to sell. So the premium on area studies and languages is going to grow, not decline. The graduate level, we need more grants now for U.S. graduate students. We need a flow of funds for replacement equipment. You aren't going to attract a lot of those bright graduates to stay on, even with improved grants, unless they have significantly improved equipment with which to conduct their research. And there's an additional factor that looms out there because of the pace of change. That's continuing education. The need to deliver at the workplace by modern technologies, continued updating in all of these areas where the pace of change is going to be very rapid. As one looks at that past history and then tries to look at how do we deal with commercializing technology for our own growth and betterment, I would try to divide the process for you arbitrarily into three different areas. One is accelerating the creation of technology. Second is accelerating the use of technology. And the third is focusing on marketing at the international marketplace. And in trying to look at how we deal with those problems, let me lay on top of that some suggestions about roles for federal government, state and local, industry, and even to be so bold as to suggest some roles for the academic community. In traveling around the country these last now almost 4 years, I am persuaded that the momentum to reduce the broad role of the federal government has very substantial momentum out supported by the population at large. And it really is taking us back to the history of the Republic. Some suspicion of government at all. A basic context of wanting most of the government that you had as close to those being governed as possible. And a Great Depression and its despair, followed by a global conflict, fundamentally changed that for a very long time frame. And we all came to expect the federal government to play the critical role in organizing, in leading, in investing, in innovating. My guess for you is that the pendulum is going to continue to swing no matter who's elected in 1988 for a great many years. That we can get the federal government to do things which do not involve additional revenues or creation of new organizations, but we are not likely to find a fertile time to create entirely new structures or new sources of funding. So the challenge in looking at the federal side is going to be to try to do a better job with what exists. I would suggest several quick areas. First, only the federal government deals with the question of antitrust. Accepting the reality that with an international marketplace, one must re-examine with care antitrust laws that were fashioned purely to regulate rapacious conduct at a domestic marketplace, focusing on products. A lot of those laws have served we consumers very well over time. So my basic interest in my pocketbook tells me that I don't want to throw out the antitrust laws in totality. But we do have to steadily adjust them to deal with the necessity of competing effectively at an international marketplace. There have already been some progress. National Cooperative Research Act of 1984, which has now made it a matter of law that joint research ventures are pro-competitive. The case must be established that there are overriding anti-competitive features. And within the guidelines for a judge in the event of action either by Justice Department or by an individual alleging anti-competitive practices from a joint research venture, the judge must consider the pro-competitive advantages at an international marketplace. There will be other areas related to accelerating the introduction of technology where more changes will be necessary. Tax policy is a proven way to produce focused investment. I won't dwell on the prospects for the current tax reform bill or the likely impact, except to say I accept the validity of the need to try to improve fairness in a tax system in order to encourage a rate of voluntary compliance, which used to be the most admirable in the world, but has begun to slip. But in that process, we must not give away the ability to provide the incentives to focus investment on the areas which accelerate not only the creation of technology, but I think more importantly in the years out ahead, its early introduction. In the existing mechanisms that already fund research, we need to focus on getting rid of arbitrary barriers that limit investment in basic science, in providing grants, and to deal with the constraints which prevent us from getting early access to technology out of federal government investment for the earliest possible commercialization. Our earlier history tells us that we knew how to do that effectively until we sat out on the trail of looking for a perfect procurement process in defense. We should write it off as not achievable. I have some sort of arbitrary approaches I would take, but I'll leave that to the question time if I stir any interest at all. On the fundamental issues of investment in education, beyond the potential for grants, some investment in basic science, that role is going to fall primarily to the state and local governments. And that's going to create some discontinuities in the society, because there are some states that are clearly focusing on it and are making great progress. And there are others that have not yet understood the contribution to long-term economic growth that's involved. On the part of industry, there's a long tradition that much of the innovative approach to use of technology really comes from the individual, the small startup company. The timeliness with which emerging technologies become visible, accessible to the broad range of potential innovators is very important. But so is the availability of capital. That availability of capital is also critically important to the established industries as well. And in a competitive world where our principal economic competitors operate with very different attitudes about debt-to-equity ratios, about the speed with which capital is available to begin productive use of new technology, and in a world where there is a very different cost of capital and a difference in the view of the time frame to recover that cost, we operate at a very substantial competitive disadvantage. Industry itself has not been remarkably active in this country in the speed with which they've moved to take new technology to the marketplace. We grew up in a long approach of looking at an assembly line. How did we maximize long-term profitability out of a process of continuing the existing technology before we had to undergo cost change? I believe we have to embark on a fundamentally different approach with a principal focus on the cost of change as a major factor in our dealing successfully, effectively over the long term with the competition at that international marketplace. The academic community has made great progress, steady progress, even with faltering federal funding. in exploring the frontiers of science and in creating new technology. The private institutions have done, in varying degrees of success, a good job in focusing on trying to move the fruits of that technology out for early commercial exploitation, sometimes because of the incentive of hoping to profit from it to pay the cost of the ongoing challenge of providing education. The public institutions have done a much poorer job. And one of the major challenges that lies out ahead is for those universities to develop the mechanisms to accelerate the movement of the fruits of their research out to commercial use. I was brazen enough several years ago to offer universities advice on how they dealt with the flow of scientific information. I don't propose, given that experience, to tell them how to deal with putting in place the mechanisms to flow technology much more rapidly to the private sector. But I have a strong sense that it's a major area that must be addressed. And I have a strong sense that there will be reluctance inside the governing bodies because of the sense that not all elements of the institution fare equally well from the fruits of that effort. And here it's going to be very essential to get the focus on what is the contribution to the society at large and its ability to compete effectively economically. Let me make one other area a topic of this conversation before I throw the floor open for questions. That's the reality of changing demographics. You're less impacted here than the part of the country where I now live. In Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California, the birth rates in the existing population are so predominantly riding with the Hispanic population, some with the blacks, but overwhelmingly with the Hispanics, that the odds are pretty high that by the turn of this decade, or certainly into the middle of the 90s, more than half those entering the workforce will be non-Caucasian. And it's going to take a very substantially different focus than we've had in the past on how we approach bringing a far larger proportion of that population, not only into greater skills at entering the workforce, but onto the train for substantially advanced education. And there's a corollary to that that relates to technology transfer. We've listened a great deal over this last 4 or 5 years to problems of the loss of technology to the Soviets, which they've used for substantial advantage at modernizing their own armed forces. We have had less dialogue about the impact of technology transfer on access to markets or on interoperability of armed forces and alliances. But there's an additional problem that lingers out ahead. As the already industrialized countries accelerate in their pursuit of a number of these emerging technologies, the gap between the have and the have-not countries is likely to broaden substantially. And that does not augur favorably for a stable world climate for economic growth. There's a challenge that lies out ahead. How do we use these same processes that we look to deal with the needs internally of adapting to changing nature of the workforce, to also try to effectively help many of those countries accelerate their ability to absorb new technology and to move into being more productive and more active members of that international economic community? Now, hopefully, I will, in these rambling remarks, have at least provided some areas that you'd like to pursue. But for another 40 minutes by the ground rules, I'm a fleeting target of opportunity.
Let me explain to you the ground rules. The floor is open for questions. The subject that Admiral Inman has spoken on is the one that he's most interested in talking about. But as a fleeting target of opportunity, to take his words, he'll try to address any other issues that people want to raise. We've come to listen to Bobby Inman and not to other people's speeches, so questions have to be limited to 1 minute. Okay? And since this is being recorded for rebroadcast on National Public Radio, I have to ask that you use one of the microphones, either here on the ground floor or on the first floor, in putting your questions. So, and let me encourage the folks from the dinner as well who didn't get to put their questions, maybe even Louis Cabot, to put us a question about defense procurement if you want, or any other subjects.
I'd like to ask you, would you like to get the microphone?
Please.
Have you thought and studied at all how this process is working in other countries, both in Western Europe? We all talk about Japan, but in Western Europe, France in particular, who's going off in a somewhat different tack, and in Soviet Russia.
Lou, in trying to break them into segments, in Western Europe, because there is a long tradition of creating technology, but if one had to characterize it sort of harshly over the post-war era, the trend has been downward in their skill at turning that technology into marketable products in a very timely way. There is a new burst of energy and flow of funding to try to accelerate the creation of technology in Western Europe, particularly in collaborative approaches. One major area comes from the common market called Esprit, focusing specifically on the information handling area. Mrs. Thatcher has her own separate, one of her highest priorities, the ALVI program, named after John Alvey, who headed the commission who examined the area. Both of those activities have a fair base of funding. The Esprit would purportedly go as high as $1.5 billion over a number of years. The ALVI program is running about $50 million a year. Both appear to be troubled to date by a good deal of bureaucracy in their execution. At least that's the criticism I hear from European companies who come over to Austin trying to look at how the MCC model is proceeding and then looking and relating their own experiences. There's more excitement about the newest program, Eureka, which the French launched, which isn't as narrowly focused on information handling, though I must say in reflection that more of that enthusiasm comes from government officials thus far than from industry officials. I think there will be, out of these efforts in Western Europe, some significant gains in creating new technology in timely ways. What I believe is even more a problem for them than for us is that transition phase, the pace at which they turn it into usable products. And there they've got a lot further to go even than we have in that process. They lag far further behind the Japanese. On the Soviets have done a very skillful job taking advantage of all of the available opportunities, at least from 1972 forward, in acquiring technology from the West to modernize their armed forces. That technology has been used in many cases in very innovative ways. We would not allege the kind of gold plating that we often talk about here in the process. They will mix the very best microelectronics use alongside vacuum tube use, where they are less dependent on the reliability of performance. What's fascinating is that flow has gone almost totally into heavy industry, the industry supporting the military buildup. There has been a singular lack of technology transfer inside the Soviet society to light industry, to what we would consider the consumer economy. There have been some rumbles in the media that perhaps Mr. Gorbachev's beginning to address those issues. But some of those comments in the late fall had gotten my expectations for the February Congress substantially higher than the policies that were actually announced. They did not go as far as I thought they might go in looking at some reordering of priorities. The only thing they've really done is to talk about trying to make all Soviet students computer literate, not defining what that means. And as I said to Tony's class earlier today, if that means that they're going to try to make computer programmers out of them all, then they're going to be in even more problems. If they're going to set out to look at far broader use of information handling techniques and trying to improve the performance of the economy, then there's some interesting prospects. The question is there enough talent to do that? They certainly would have to drain it off from the heavy industry and the focus on the military modernizations. There are also some real impacts on the society and how they govern. If they think they've had trouble limiting the flow of information with controlling the flow of books, wait until they have their own hackers to deal with communication flow and networks. Now, the Japanese side, you all know. But the one point I would make about the Japanese effort, they've done a tremendous job of using technologies they've acquired from outside Japan for a whole range of products, and fierce competition in Japan as well as abroad in the marketing of the products that flow out of that in competing companies in the same industry. They have begun some significant efforts at enhancing their ability to create technology, not just waiting for its export. But the area that I think is far more challenging to U.S. competitiveness is their focus on manufacturing technology. Focus on systems approach to automation and providing the capital to implement it. And dealing, rather than moving offshore for manufacturing, looking for cheap labor, they'll come to this country not looking for cheap labor, but looking for guaranteed market access. But much of their focus is on accelerating manufacturing technology approaches. And that's something I forgot in my earlier rambling remarks, that we critically need out of the academic community from leadership, combined effort by the colleges of business administration, the College of Engineering, elevating the depth of interest and approach to manufacturing technology, systems approach, and working with industry and trying to accelerate the pace at which we move in those directions. And there's clearly a role for unions in their attitudes about that also.
If we have several business school professors here, I don't know if one would like to comment or not. Professor Gishino, would you like to make a comment on how about Professor Lodge then?
Pause here. Admiral Inman, I'd like to ask you a question about MCC and how successful you think it has been. Particularly, how successful have you been in transferring from MCC back to the member companies the kinds of technology which can make those companies more successful and more competitive in the marketplace, and how would you compare that, let's say, with the VLSI project in Japan?
Professor Lodge, I'm not sure I can answer the last part of that very effectively. Let me try to hit it, the rest of them. First, on MCC's performance. First challenge was to get the companies to be able to work together effectively. The second was to acquire the depth and breadth of talent that offered the process that you could truly accelerate the creation of technology. And the third major challenge was to put in place the processes and work at them for transferring that technology to the shareholders. Now, they counted on these being very long-term programs, shortest duration 6 years, almost half the effort out toward 10 years. They were not focused on looking for early results to use. On getting the companies to work together, the suspicion at the outset amongst the competitors was palpable. They were sure somebody was going to have an inside track, and getting clear and absolute sense of fairness was essential. And there was that suspicion was visible in the requirement that any change of the bylaws, no matter how minor, required a unanimous consent of all the shareholders. That was with 10. Well, there are now 21 companies. Last September, they unanimously agreed to change that provision to permit subsequent modifications of the bylaws by 3/4 vote. They have learned to work together and to not worry about the tyranny of a majority, and to understand that you have to be able to make sensible changes as time evolves. On the personnel side, they had advertised, or at least put forth the concept, that all the talent that was needed was to be found within the shareholder companies. I'll grant that most of them at least believed that. They simply thought the talent was going to come from the other company, not from their own. When it came to releasing scarce, treasured talent, there was reluctance. The answer was to go outside. Almost all of the leadership and the bulk of the senior management, the next level down, are direct hire. In fact, 2/3 of all the researchers are direct hire. As it became very clear that we could fill the place entirely with outside talent, we began to see some resumes of some truly outstanding youngsters from the shareholder companies, some of the shareholder companies, wanting them to be a part of it. And so the third from the shareholder companies are indeed very good people. They are not people who were deposited because they were easy to assign. Out of that effort, progress is going on at a pace that at least I'm pretty pleased with in creation of new technology. It was clear by March of '84 that the process of assembling talent and getting the companies to work together was going to work. That was going to go. And my focus turned to what was and remains my number one worry, and that's technology transfer. The early concept was tied to that expecting the talent to come from the companies. Their response to me was that in dealing with technology transfer, that I shouldn't worry about it, that the talent would come from the companies, they'd create the technology, and they would take it back with them as they went back. Well, my worry is too late. You're already irrelevant at that point in time, and in all likelihood, the strategies will already be shaped of where those companies are planning to go with their next generation of products. So we took a very different approach. Every phase of research must be documented, and that documentation must be expeditiously provided to all of the companies that fund that program. A program manager may withhold fruits of research for only one reason: quality control. Now, with that process, we run a real risk that one or more of the companies would go to the marketplace with the research results without giving us credit, without putting us in line to ultimately have some part of royalties. And that's a worry. But I consider it a far less worry than the likelihood of irrelevance of the research that we produce. We have put in place not only the master technology transfer plans, the licensing arrangements, the provisions for inter-program technology transfer, but a constant effort at trying to immerse the companies in what's coming out. I see, with 21 shareholders, 21 different approaches to technology transfer. Some of the companies are already at the stage of renting office space and apartments and sending some very able people whose resumes I did not see at an earlier point in time to come and spend 6 weeks at a time absorbing, working alongside, beginning to try to understand how the technologies would be used, and to begin to put in place in their companies the tracking mechanisms, the receptor organizations that offer the prospect of their being able to use the technology rapidly. That is not a uniform approach across the companies. And my real worry several years down the road is that we'll end up with some of the companies not having benefited from the research they helped fund. At this point, I'm already comfortable that a majority will have done so. But I'd like a lot higher batting average than that for this process over the long term. And I'm not really comfortable yet that that process is in place. And it will be very obvious to you. I find it frustrating because that's one I can't control.
Why don't you take one from microphone B, please?
Please.
And then next up here.
Thank you.
Admiral, I've got a very simple question, something you said that I didn't understand, maybe you can help me with. When you were referring to businesses of the future, or opportunities of the future, you were referring to satellites and how there's only so much space up there. Unless we come up with a way to vacuum up some of that debris, we'd only be able to fit so many up there. And I think you're implying that's going to therefore make the ones that are up there more valuable. What I don't understand is every time I read the Wall Street Journal, I see that it gets cheaper to send them up. Everyone that goes up gets a little bit cheaper. Now, that may change with the space accident of recent. But in addition to that, the same technology, I would think, of that example you gave with the computer, this room, now you can get a computer that could fit on top of the podium, 100 times more capacity in 10 more years, 100 times more again on your thumbnail, which equals, what, 10,000 times the capacity. Why won't that same technology make the satellites that much smaller? And since they're cheaper going up, and since you could fit more on a spacecraft, you could put many up there. Why wouldn't that make the guy who buys a satellite now for $1 billion have to compete with a guy who's going to be able to buy one for a few thousand?
The cost has already gone down remarkably, and of the building the satellites, the cost of getting them up there has not gone down. And given our troubles over this past year, in fact, we're looking at sort of moving in the opposite direction on that process. The problem is still a different one.
And this cost has gone down?
The cost of building them has gone down, the satellites themselves.
Okay.
The cost of getting them up is not yet going down in an attractive kind of way. But when you're trying to get them out 22,000 miles out, the precision of delivering at that range is not the same. And unfortunately, these are very fragile platforms. And then maybe we'll come up with some whole new power source approaches that reduce our reliance on looking at the solar panels that are displayed, a variety of things which are used now, which are very fragile to any kind of foreign debris. 1986, this is not a significant problem. But in 1996, it is potentially a problem. How significant it is debatable.
Okay, thank you.
Microphone C.
I'd be interested in hearing your comments on the trade-offs between the dissemination of technological information and national security.
In looking at the trade-offs between dissemination of information and national security, you have to examine the problem from several different aspects. One is the specific potential military application, the exclusivity of military application. But you have to tie onto that, I believe, military application in regard to interoperability with alliance military forces, not just your own military forces. The second factor that's essential in looking at the trade-off is the likely source of origin. Do you have the exclusive ability to create that technology? or is there a potential that it could be created by other countries? And the third is the essential question of how do you open markets to fair economic competition? At least one of the demonstrated ways of doing that in the past is by export of technology. Now, there have been a vast number of instances where we simply sold the license, but there have been others where access to new technology has been made contingent on opening a market for sale of products by U.S. companies. Now, how do you try to find some balance in that process? Well, you have to do it by some sensible way to structure policy. My preferred approach is an assignment of responsibilities to the National Security Advisor, the NSC staff, National Security Council. When we defined national security in 1947, we worried about diplomacy and the size and deployment of our defense forces, as I said earlier in my remarks. We moved to include foreign aid and then ultimately arms control. But in the reality of the 80s and the 90s,